Story 1. The Mysterious Tent. The following is a story that happened to me and my friends about 4 years ago. My friends Alex and Chris and I headed to a remote part of the Sierra Nevada to go camping and fishing. We had been in this spot before and very much enjoyed it, so we decided to go back and make a weekend of it. Well, I wouldn't be telling this story if something incredibly creepy didn't happen. We had trekked deep into the forest to our spot. We loved it because we would be far from anybody else. Just the three of us, and the serene beauty of nature, that type of thing, you know? On the second day, we set out to go fishing. All was well. We traveled up the river some and had a blast. A few hours before sunset, we decided that we should get back so that we could get a fire going before dark. When we got back to the campsite, we noticed that there was another tent oddly close to ours. Uncomfortably close, maybe 75 to 80 feet away. It was a plain old tent, with no other camping equipment in sight. Our first impressions were ones of annoyance. We were out in the middle of nowhere, and of all the places that someone could throw up a tent, they do it here, right next to ours. Out of courtesy, though, we approached the tent, calling out a greeting. No response. We called again, and again, nothing. It appeared that no one was there. Finally, Chris came across and said that he was going to take a look inside. "Best not," I said. But before I could even finish, he was making his way over. He walked over, slowly and cautiously. When he reached the door, he slowly unzipped it. "What do you see?" Alex asked. "Nothing," Chris replied. "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing inside." We were all confused, but assumed the occupant was out exploring or something, so we went about our day, trying to shrug off the unease. It got darker and darker and darker. As we went about our business, we kept making glances over at the tent, expecting someone to show up at some point. We had gotten lost in our own affairs when out of nowhere, a light flicked on from the inside of the tent. Inside was the silhouette of a single person that we could see. We all looked at each other. Nobody ever saw anybody walk over and into the tent. At this point, the creepiness was off the charts. We didn't expect for things to get any creepier, but they did. "Go say something," Chris said to me. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "Anything." I hesitated but finally gave in. I walked over slowly, watching the silhouette the entire time. It was motionless, just sitting there in the middle of the tent doing nothing. I got closer and closer. My heart was pounding out of my chest. When I got within about 15 feet, just as I was about to speak up, I could see the head of this person, or whatever it was, begin to turn slowly, like it was looking over in my direction. I looked back at the guys, and they were motioning for me to continue. I turned back towards the tent, and just as I was about to speak out, a blood-curdling scream came from within the tent. Before I could even realize it, I had turned and was running back towards the guys. We were all in a panic at this point. What just happened? Who was this person? What in the hell is going on? We argued amongst ourselves, frantically trying to decide what to do. As we did, I reached into my pocket to grab my phone. Zero reception. Not even a single bar. It was the dead of night now. We were out in the middle of nowhere, had no cell phone reception, and there was a mysterious tent 75 feet away from us with an unknown occupant that had let out a scream like none of us had ever heard before. We were absolutely terrified. As we argued about what to do, there was motion from within the tent. The silhouette appeared to be looking in our direction still, though it was difficult to tell. It said nothing. Then, after a few seconds, it looked like this person was raising their arm up to the top of the tent. We were all wide-eyed, locked into the motion coming from within the tent. And then, out of nowhere, the light inside the tent went out. "What in the hell? What in the hell?" we were all saying to each other. Questions were flying, but we had no answers. None of us knew what to do. We had gear and supplies and tents everywhere, and we were miles from our vehicle. We went back and forth trying to figure out what to do. Finally, we decided that we would go ahead and stay the night, and wait until daylight to try to make sense out of everything. From there, we would just leave altogether, if the unknown person had not yet made contact with us. However, we would take shifts with one of us staying awake to watch over the creepy visitor. "Keep the fire going," I said. The other two agreed. Alex was first up. At around 1 a.m., Alex woke up Chris. As they told me, they switched shifts with no new events taking place. As far as they knew, the weird person was still in the tent. Surprisingly, I managed to get some sleep. It wasn't enough, though. Chris woke me up at 4 a.m., and I was to take over until daylight. As Alex crawled into his tent, I threw more wood on the fire. I remember sitting there, wide awake at first. The fire was nice. It provided some comfort in contrast to our unknown visitor. I remember watching the tent for any movement. Nothing. I would watch the fire for a little while, and then look over at the tent. I did this over and over and over. I remember getting more and more tired. After about an hour or so, I was struggling to stay awake. I would doze off, just to catch myself, and then doze off again. Finally, fatigue won over, and I fell asleep. The next thing I remember is that it was daylight and Chris was shaking me. "Wake up, what the hell?" he said. "Where did the person go?" I looked over to the mysterious tent. There was nothing. It was gone. "You fell asleep?" Chris said in somewhat of an annoyed voice. At this point, Alex was making his way out of his tent. "Where'd they go?" he said. "I don't know," I replied. We searched for any sign of the person. There was nothing, not even footprints. It was like they were never there in the first place. At this point, we had enough. It was daylight now, so we began to pack our things. We weren't going to wait around to see if the person returned. We were exhausted when we arrived back home. It was a trip that we will never forget. To this day, we have no idea who the person was, or what their intentions were. Was it some sick prank? Was someone trying to scare us off of the spot for good? Unfortunately, we may never know. We never went back to that spot again. It's a shame. It was one of our favorites. But I guess the fear of the unknown visitor was enough to keep us away for good. Story 2. The Ozark Encounter. My name is Tyler, and the story I'm about to tell happened to my friend Connor and me back in 2009. It's the creepiest encounter I've ever had in my life, and I think Connor would say the same. We decided to go camping out in the Ozarks. The main idea was to get away from the usual touristy camping spots, soak in nature, just two guys away from society. The plan was to hike out on a couple of trails, and then at some point in our hike, veer off deep into the woods without getting lost. And that's exactly what we did. A couple of hours into our hike, we started walking in deep. I would say probably a third of a mile in, we saw what looked like a rickety old shack through the trees in the distance off to our right. Connor, the adventurer, wanted to check it out, but I wasn't so sure. The shack, from where we stood, seemed very off-putting to me. It looked like there was stuff hanging from the trees, too, but curiosity got the better of us, and we crept closer. Here's where it gets creepy. Surrounding the shack, in the trees, were at least 3 dozen dolls. Baby dolls. Dirty, disgusting, lifeless eyes, and terrifyingly creepy. The shack, though beat up and decrepit, looked livable. Both of us immediately got the creeps and decided it was time to go. We turned around to bolt, and when we did, there was an old man standing there just staring at us. He was probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with a beard, ragged clothes, and disgustingly dirty. His eyes were just locked onto us. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought he could hear it. Finally he said, "Why are you on my property?" His voice was calm, but had an underlying coldness that gave me the shivers. "We're so sorry, sir," Connor said. His voice was shaking a little bit. "We were just hiking and got curious. We didn't think anyone lived here." The man just stood there for a minute. Finally his eyes broke off of us and he looked over at the dolls. "What do you think of my dolls?" he asked. I exchanged a nervous look over at Connor. They're unique," I said to him. He looked back over at us, again with that locking, piercing gaze. "I'm always adding new ones to my collection," he said. Neither of us dared to speak. We were both literally paralyzed. After what felt like an eternity, he finally said, "Well, you boys best move along. Enjoy your trip. But be careful. There are a lot of weirdos out here." Our hearts were beating out of our chests. We managed a weak laugh and practically ran from there. I took a glance back as we were leaving, and the man just continued to stare at us. We hiked what felt like miles before setting up camp. Connor tried to brush off our encounter, saying we probably just met a lonely old man, and the dolls might be some weird hobby. I wanted to believe that, but I didn't. I didn't even want to camp anymore, but we were out in the middle of nowhere and the sun was fading quick. We set up camp, built a small fire, and got a bite to eat. As the hours ticked away, we both finally succumbed to exhaustion and decided to turn in for the night. We put the fire out, climbed into our tents, and fell off to sleep. The night was mostly uneventful. Other than the normal sounds of the forest, neither of us heard anything out of the ordinary. In the morning, though, I was jolted awake by Connor losing his mind. "Tyler, get up! Get out here, man!" I threw the blankets off of me and jumped up. As I unzipped my tent, I saw them. 2 dolls, laying on the ground, one just outside the entrance to each of our tents. Honestly, my first thought was that it was a joke. "Did you put these here?" I asked Tyler, thinking he may have grabbed them and put them in his bag when we were at the shack yesterday, and I wasn't looking. "Hell no, I didn't," he exclaimed. I could tell by the fear in his eyes that he was being serious. Needless to say, we packed up and got the hell out of there. Our trip was done, and we weren't going back. We left the dolls behind and quickly made our exit. On the way back, we took a different route, stopping every now and then to scan the woods to make sure we weren't being followed. We were that terrified. As I look back now, I think the 2 dolls were a warning. The old man was telling us to never come back there again. If that was the message, I can assure you, it was received loud and clear. Story 3. The Dark Night at Cline Falls. The following is an account told by one of the survivors to my mother and passed on to me. It is a terrifying true story, not one for those who frighten easily. In the warmth of summer in 1977, 2 youthful spirits with dreams as expansive as the open road embarked on a journey unlike any other. Their mission was simple: traverse the transcontinental expanse of America on their bicycles, breathing in every story, every landmark, every whispered legend of the places they visited. The winding roads took them to the picturesque town of Cline Falls, Oregon, a place that promised serenity and the gentle music of cascading water. The riverside beckoned them. Setting up their tent amidst the soft grass, with the river's gentle ripples as their lullaby, the 2 friends indulged in tales of their adventures so far. The golden hues of the setting sun dappled the water, creating an almost ethereal glow. The world felt right, and the night promised nothing but restful dreams. But as they say, darkness often lurks where it's least expected. Their peaceful slumber was abruptly ruptured by a sound that neither would ever forget, a mix of grinding metal and the violent churn of tires against soft earth. Before either could react, the crushing weight of a speeding truck bore down upon their tent, rendering them trapped and gasping for breath beneath its oppressive frame. The world outside was a cacophony of muted sounds. Their hearts raced, their minds struggled to process the nightmare unfolding around them, and then a new horror emerged. The truck's door creaked ominously. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and menacing, drew closer. The dim silhouette of a man clutching an axe became visible, moonlight glinting off the blade's polished surface. What followed was a dance of terror. The man attacked with a ferocity that seemed inhuman. Each strike of the axe was a message of malevolence, a testament to the depths of human cruelty. The women, trapped and defenseless, could do little more than hope and pray for an end to the ordeal. But as quickly as the onslaught began, it ceased. Leaving behind an eerie silence, the attacker retreated, leaving the campsite a grotesque tableau of shattered hopes and physical devastation. Yet amidst the carnage, a glimmer of the human spirit's resilience shone through. Though injured and in shock, one of the 2 women, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she had, managed to free herself from the wreckage. Every step was an agony, but she was propelled by a single thought: to find help. She stumbled and staggered toward the main road, her silhouette painted in moonlight, blood, and sheer determination. A glint of hope arrived in the form of approaching headlights. A family, returning from a late-night excursion, pulled over, their faces a mix of shock and concern as they took in Sarah's disheveled appearance. Upon hearing her harrowing tale, they acted swiftly, deciding to accompany her back to the campsite and help her friend. But fate had one more twist in store. As the group neared the campsite, the roar of an all-too-familiar engine pierced the night. The very truck, the instrument of their earlier torment, was back. Its headlights, like malevolent eyes, bore down upon them. The air grew thick with tension as the attacker seemed to evaluate his odds. But the sight of the family in their car, and possibly the fear of being outnumbered or identified, prompted a change of heart. With a deafening roar and a spray of gravel, he sped away, disappearing once more into the shadows from which he had emerged. The subsequent days were an intense blend of physical healing, police inquiries, and media attention. Their story of survival against overwhelming odds captured the nation's heart. But for all the attention, one question remained unanswered. Who was the man behind the wheel that night? Though theories abounded, from jilted lovers to transients with dark pasts, the identity of the malevolent attacker remained an enigma, a dark blot on Cline Falls history. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the legacy of that experience remains. The women, bonded by trauma and survival, went on to lead lives defined not by their victimhood, but by their resilience and unwavering spirit. Their tale stands as a testament to human endurance, the ability to rise from the ashes, and the ever-present hope that even in the darkest times, dawn awaits.
Story 4. We Were Stalked. The story I am about to tell happened to my friend Emily and me last summer in the Sam Houston National Forest in East Texas. Emily and I decided to go on a camping trip. We've been best friends since childhood, and our shared love for adventure and the great outdoors had brought us there. The reason for our camping trip was pretty simple. We needed a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. We both love the outdoors, the woods, wildlife, and a sense of peace that you just can't get in the city. We wanted to enjoy the outdoors, unplug from our devices, and reconnect with nature. After a day of hiking and fun, we set up camp in a beautiful clearing, surrounded by huge trees. The sun got low, so we started a small campfire and shared stories. We were laughing and reminiscing about our childhood. The night was calm and amazing at first. We were having such a good time. But very quickly, things went south. A little after midnight, Emily and I decided to call it a night. We threw some water on the fire and headed to our tents, each one only a few feet apart from the other. Inside my tent, I wished Emily a good night and closed my eyes. I don't know how much time went by, but shortly after I dozed off, I woke up when I started hearing noises from the wood line. At first, it was like a grunting noise. I told myself to chill, and that it was probably a deer or something. Maybe it was a deer snort rather than a grunt. Well, that instantly changed when the grunts turned to growls. Low, guttural growls. Whatever it was sounded absolutely massive. There was something else, too, that I noticed that I hadn't before when I first started hearing the grunts. It was completely silent. There was nothing. No crickets, no frogs, no bugs. Absolutely nothing. By this time, I'm pretty terrified now, and I start calling for Emily. She was wide awake too. I asked her if she was hearing the same thing that I was, and she said that she was. Neither of us knew what the hell to do. We were miles from anything and had nowhere to go. I told her I was coming over, and so I grabbed my phone and things and hurried over to her tent. Once I got over there, we went back and forth about what to do. We were out in the middle of nowhere and had absolutely no cell phone reception. The growls kept coming and they were getting louder. We started hearing branches breaking too. There was something out there. It sounded really large, and it seemed like it was pissed. We finally decided that we should get a fire going again. We just didn't know what else to do. Luckily, we still had a bunch of wood, and so we hopped out of the tent and got to work. I got a flashlight and started pointing it at the woods, but didn't see anything. Emily was working on the fire, and at first it was hard to get one going because we had dumped water on the previous one. But after some work, we finally got it going. I set my light down to grab more wood, and all of a sudden I looked over at Emily, and she was looking out at the wood line, and she was shaking, almost violently. I called out to her, but she was absolutely petrified. I kept asking her what it was and what was going on, but she couldn't say anything. Finally, she kind of motioned her head towards the woods and said, "There's something staring at us." I looked over at the wood line, and at first I didn't see anything, but then I saw it. It was a massive silhouette of something, and it looked like it was creeping behind a tree. When I say massive, I don't mean large, I mean it was absolutely massive. All I could make out was a shoulder, arm, and half of a head at first. It looked like it was hairy all over. And then, it stepped out from the tree that it was behind. It was upright, completely covered in hair and on two legs. Its arms were unnaturally long and it looked like it had hands. It's hard to tell, but if I had to guess the height of what I was looking at, I would say that it had to have been between 8 and 9 feet tall. It's hard to describe in words just how big this thing was. What I'm about to say next is where I lose most people in the very few times that I've told this story. When it came out from behind the tree and looked at us, its eyes were glowing red. I swear on everything they were glowing. It wasn't eye shine. They were glowing, and they were red. And I say it was a thing because it was not a man. The way it moved was so fluid that it couldn't be a man in a suit, and it was way too large. It went behind another tree, and for a moment it was completely silent. Nothing. And then we heard a blood-curdling scream. It was so loud and so powerful that both of us believed that we were going to die. Both of us gripped each other and started crying, almost uncontrollably, just shaking and crying and not knowing what to do. The thing was growling and moving around, and we could hear branches breaking all over. We stood there absolutely frozen. Then at some point during all of this, I snapped out of it. I came to the realization that we were out in the middle of nowhere and had nowhere to go. I looked at Emily and shook her a little bit to try to snap her out of it too. She looked at me and I said, "Listen, we need to get this fire going as much as possible. We need to make it big." She nodded and I told her to start throwing more wood on it. So she started doing that and I grabbed the flashlight again. I pointed it towards the wood line, but whatever it wasn't there anymore. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't where it was standing before. I don't know, but something told me that maybe the light will keep it away. And so that's what I did. I turned the flashlight on high beam and pointed it at the wood line. I started scanning the wood line back and forth, back and forth. I was terrified. If it wasn't where we had seen it earlier, where was it? Did it go back into the woods? Was it sneaking up on us? I didn't know, and that absolutely terrified me. I scanned all around the perimeter of our campsite and didn't see anything, so I at least felt like it wasn't sneaking up on us. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. All I could think to do was just keep fire and light going and wait it out, and then get the hell out of there as soon as there was daylight. And so that's what we did. For probably 3 hours we kept wood on the fire, and I kept constantly scanning the woods with my flashlight. During this time we continued to hear growls, rustling, and branches breaking. It seemed like the fire and the light were working, though. There were 2 other times that I saw glowing, or what I believed to be its eyes in the woods. Both times it was at a distance, and both times they ducked out as soon as my flashlight hit them. Eventually, as the sun started coming up, the noises started retreating. There were fewer and fewer growls and fewer branch breaks. The sun finally topped out over the horizon, and we didn't hear anything else. When we were confident that whatever it was gone, we grabbed our phones and backpacks and headed out. We left the tents, fire, and everything else behind. We were probably about 4 miles out from the car, and so we made our way back as quickly as possible. scanning the woods as we went. When we finally got back to the car, we hopped in and drove away as fast as we could. We never returned for our tents and haven't been back since. After telling this story to a few close family and friends, it was clear that they thought we were crazy. They asked if we were drinking. They asked if we were doing drugs. And the answer to all of these questions has always been no. And so eventually we quit telling this story to everyone. To this day, I don't know what it was that we saw that night, but I do know for certain that there is something absolutely terrifying out there, and Emily and I will never venture out into those woods ever again at night. That's my story. It happened, and nobody will ever convince me that I didn't see what I saw or experience what I experienced.
Story 5. Fear can cover ground pretty fast. Let me tell you about the most terrifying experience I've ever had. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me, the wilderness, and a well-earned break from everyday life. I'd been walking most of the morning, deep into the woods, looking for that perfect spot to set up camp. That's when I crossed paths with him, this guy with hardly any gear, which was the first red flag out there in the middle of nowhere. There was something about his eyes, a glazed-over look, like he wasn't all there. I tried to be friendly, just a nod as I passed, but he returned it with a stare that put me on edge. I kept walking, trying to shake off the unease as I listened to his footsteps heading the other way. But then they stopped. I glanced back, and there he was, standing dead center on the trail, just staring at me. It was like one of those moments in a horror flick where everything goes silent. He must have realized I caught him because he spun around and carried on like nothing happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something incredibly off about the guy. The further I walked, the stronger that feeling got. Call it instincts or paranoia or whatever, but I decided to trust it. I veered off the trail, found a thick patch of brush, and waited. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, I saw him hustling down the path, moving fast in the direction I would have been walking. My heart was pounding in my chest. This guy was looking for me. I stayed hidden, taking shallow breaths and trying to remain as quiet as possible. Eventually he came back into view, walking the other way. I waited, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, making sure he was long gone before I even thought about getting back on that trail. Continuing on, I walked with a brisk pace, trying to put the encounter behind me. Maybe he was lost and was just going to ask for directions, I told myself, deep down inside knowing that that probably wasn't true. I'd walked for quite a while and finally decided to get a camp going. The sun was getting low, so I found a spot and set up my tent. Settling into sleep, I'd mostly put the encounter behind me. I remember thinking I'd outwalked the fear, but it turns out fear can cover ground pretty fast when it wants to. Waking up in the dead of night is disorienting at the best of times, but when you wake to a sound that shouldn't be there, it's downright terrifying. There was a loud sound coming from just outside my tent door. It was rhythmic and deep. At first I was frozen in place trying to place the sound. I'd heard it a million times before. I knew I had. But when it's right outside your tent, in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, common sounds can be hard to place. Mustering the strength to investigate, I slowly and quietly stood up and unzipped my tent to get a look. What I saw shot panic into every cell of my body. There, on the ground, just a few feet away from the entrance to my tent, was the creepy man from the trail. He was in a deep sleep, the sound of his rhythmic snoring echoing through the dark forest. My heart was in my mouth, pounding against my teeth. I couldn't stay there. In my panic, and not quite in my right mind, I made a split decision. I threw on my shoes, my shirt and pants, and slipped out of the tent, zipping it up behind me. I fled into the trees once more. I hadn't really thought the plan through. I guess in my panic, I just wanted to get as far away from the creep as quickly as possible without him noticing. I left my bag, flashlight, cell phone, and just about everything else inside the tent. Not that it mattered. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and there was no way that I'd get any type of signal to make a call. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first light filtered through the branches, I saw him wake. He was disoriented at first, but then he stood and examined my tent. His movements were slow and quiet, like he was trying not to wake me. As I watched from a distance, he did something I'll never forget. He sniffed my tent. Not just a casual smell. It was like he was trying to fill his lungs with my scent. It was then I knew I wasn't dealing with a regular person. Fear had me in a grip I've never felt before, and it was squeezing tight. He started looking around, probably thinking I was still in the tent. I remember as he slowly began to wander off, leaving his stuff behind. For what purpose, I couldn't tell you. My best guess is that maybe he went to relieve himself. It was then that I seized my chance. I quickly and quietly made my way back, grabbed my backpack, zipped the tent back up, and left it behind. As I put a good bit of distance between us, I could hear the creepy man in the distance, shouting, filled with rage or frustration, or both. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. Reaching my car was like finding an oasis in the desert. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the authorities. They searched, but they never found him. No trace, like he was a ghost. But I know he was real. They did find something else, though. My tent, and the few items I left inside it. It was destroyed. The most terrifying part? It was slashed apart. Every piece of canvas was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. That trip was meant to be a break from the real world, but it ended up being anything but. I often think about what in the world that guy was up to. Why was he following me? Why in the hell did he sniff my tent? And what was he shouting out after he found out I had flown the coop? People often tell stories of encounters with bears or mountain lions or even wild hogs. For me, though, the most terrifying thing I can possibly think to encounter again in the woods walks on two legs. Story 6. Which way did they go? You know how you look back on some memories, and they're like snapshots, crisp and clear, like they just happened yesterday? That's how I remember that weekend. My best friend Mark and I, we had this tradition since forever, heading out into the wild, just us and the essentials. When he called me up and said, "Hey, let's do the forest thing this weekend," I didn't think twice. We'd always loved the way the forest could drown out the chaos from the world. As kids, it was our adventure land. As adults, it became our retreat. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, and lots of dry food and snacks, along with plenty of water. That's all we needed. The drive up was the same as it always had been, full of dumb jokes and the kind of deep conversations that only seem to happen when you're on the road. We parked, walked, and reached our usual spot by the afternoon. It was a cozy little nook by a stream, far enough from the beaten path to feel like we had the whole forest to ourselves. We pitched our tents, got a fire going, and settled in. The hours slipped by with the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the water. Just a couple of guys catching up on life. It was great. Waking up the next morning, we packed up after some campfire coffee and headed out. Mark wanted to check out another spot, a few miles off, down an old logging road that wasn't much more than a dirt track by then. Walking down that road felt good, stretching the legs, breathing in nature's air. As we walked, we stumbled upon this old truck, off to the side, on the shoulder. We couldn't tell how long it had been there, but something in my gut told me that it hadn't been there long. As we walked on, our blissful weekend took a turn. We could see someone in the distance. It wasn't until we got closer that we could begin to make out details. He was shirtless, which was weird because there was a cool bite to the air. More alarming, though, he was mumbling and gesturing his arms erratically, lost in his own world. As we cautiously walked within a few feet of the man, his eyes glared over at us. It was disturbing, the way he seemed so disconnected from everything, except for us. Our best guess was that the man was on some type of drugs, which was terrifying, because here we were, out in the middle of nowhere, with someone that was off his rocker. We kept our distance, and our eyes, on the individual as we picked up the pace. But as we thought that we were in the clear, the sound of someone yelling made us stop dead in our tracks. It was this guttural shout, full of anger and something else. Mark and I felt like we were in a compromised position. We were caught between a crazed lunatic on, well, something, and an intimidating voice coming from a distance around a bend in the road. The yelling guy was calling for the shirtless man, and it was clear that he was angry. Mark looked at me, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. While the lunatic was distracted, caught up in his own world, and before the angry man, having not yet seen us, could make his way around the bend, we nipped off the road and into the underbrush, putting as much of the dense forest between us and them as possible. We found a spot to hide, crouching down among the ferns and fallen leaves, our hearts thudding in our chests. The voices were getting closer. We could make out bits and pieces. The angry guy was now talking to the shirtless man. They were having some sort of argument. Then we heard it, clear as a bell. Which way did they go? They were looking for us. Why, I couldn't tell you. But right then, it didn't matter. We felt like we were the prey in a hunt we didn't understand. "You know what happens if we get caught, right?" the angry voice said. "Find them. Now." All thoughts of camping, of another night under the stars, vanished. It was about survival now. We waited, barely breathing, and watched. "We gotta go," Mark said to me. He was right. Having disappeared between the lunatic and the angry man, and with the other side of the road having a very steep incline, there's only one place we could have gone, into the woods. If we stayed, we were almost sure to be found. Before the men could make their way into the woods, we moved back, slowly and quietly. No trails, no noise, just as much distance as we could, as quickly as we could. The farther we got, the more quickly we moved, until we were off in a dead sprint. When the car finally came into view, it was like a beacon of civilization calling us back from the edge. We didn't bother with packing things neatly. We just threw everything into the trunk and got the hell out of there. The city never looked so good, with its loud streets and crowded sidewalks. I'll never take the city for granted ever again. I often reflect back on that weekend with so many questions. What were the men doing? What were they hiding? What if we had ventured a little bit further and seen something that we shouldn't have? What would have happened to us then? Maybe it's best not to know. Sometimes, I guess, you stumble into the wild. Other times, the wild finds you. Story 7. Game Cam Terror. Ever since I was a kid, I've had this thing for the woods. It's like stepping into a different realm where the rules of the city don't apply. You can breathe out there. So when life's noise got too loud, I'd pack up and head out to this spot I found years back. It's out past the edge of a cell signal, where the stress of life can't reach you. This time, I was off for a 3-nighter. The drive up was therapeutic, just me and the summer breeze blowing into the cabin of my truck. When I turned off onto the dirt road that snaked its way into the heart of the forest, I could almost feel everyday life shedding from my skin. I got to my spot in the late afternoon. It's a little clearing, surrounded by old pines. The first task was setting up the tent, a ritual that would lay my claim to the land for a couple of days. But as I staked it down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was already something different about this trip. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to catch a glimpse of something. But there was nothing there. Just the quiet woods and the occasional bird call. I tried to busy myself, gathering wood for the fire, laying out my sleeping setup, doing all those little camp chores that help you settle in. But it was like there was static in the air, a charge that made my skin tingle. When night fell, every crack of a branch had me jolting upright, straining my ears for any sound out of place. It was weird, because I'd never been this way out here before. I've always been a rational guy. I don't spook easy, but this was different. This feeling, this sense that I wasn't alone, gnawed at me through the night, a persistent dread that I couldn't let go of. Come morning, I was bleary-eyed from lack of sleep. The uneasy feeling I had was still there, though. Feeling that I needed to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I remembered the game camera I'd tossed in with my gear. I brought it on a whim, thinking it might be cool to catch some wildlife shots. But now, it had a new purpose. I set it up on a tree with a good view of my tent, thinking it'd act like a security camera. I'd see that there was nothing there but me, and finally be able to get some peace. The day passed slow. I tried to fish in the nearby stream and read some of the book I'd brought along, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing back to that camera, like it held the answer to a question I hadn't asked. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I felt that unease intensifying. Nevertheless, I ate my dinner and settled into a book by the campfire. That night was worse than the first. Every sound seemed magnified. I felt like I was hearing footsteps, but played it off as just something in my mind. I lay there in the dark, thinking of the camera, of what it might be seeing while I tried to fall asleep. At first light, I was out of the tent and at the camera. I told myself to be ready for a laugh, for the sight of a raccoon's curious face or a herd of deer standing in the distance. But when I flicked through the photos in the little 2-inch LCD screen, the fear that had gripped me all weekend was validated. There was a man, not just passing by, but standing there, stock still, looking right at my tent. It was the middle of the night. The timestamps read between 2:04 and 2:18 a.m. For 14 minutes the stranger stood and stared at my tent. It gave me chills just thinking that a thin slice of canvas was all that stood between me and this individual as I slept. Terror has sharp teeth that can clamp down on you, like a shark in the water. My trip was over, my 3-nighter having just turned into a 2-nighter. I threw everything into the back of the truck. The tent, half collapsed, my sleeping bag a tangled mess. It didn't matter. I was done, and I was leaving. The trees blurred past, a green tunnel that seemed to tighten around me as I drove. I reported it to the rangers, even showing them the photos on my game cam. They took it seriously, promised to look into it, but what could they do? The woods are vast, and a man like that, a ghost in the night, he wouldn't be found if he didn't want to be. He didn't steal anything that I knew of, and I wasn't assaulted in any way. But still, I felt like my space and my peace of mind were violated. It's been a while since that trip, and I'll be honest, it's been a while since I've been in the woods. The gear is still in my garage, picking up a little bit of dust. Someday I'll go back, I tell myself, but not just yet. Story 8. Campfire in the Distance. Years ago, I decided to embark on a hiking trip through the Ouachita Mountains. I was 26 at the time, confident in my outdoor skills, and ready for a few days of privacy and nature. I could never have anticipated how that journey would turn into a crazy story of survival and fear. The first day was everything I had hoped for. The Ouachita's sprawling beauty was mesmerizing, with towering trees and the distant calls of wildlife. I found a perfect spot to set up camp as the evening approached, near a large, oddly shaped rock that jutted out from the ground like it had been there for thousands of years. That night, I fell asleep to the symphony of the woods, feeling completely at ease. The tranquility, however, didn't last long. I awoke early the next morning to a disconcerting discovery. Surrounding my tent were footprints, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. They circled my campsite, meandering off into the dense underbrush. My heart skipped a beat upon first finding them. Who else was out here, and why had they been lurking around my tent while I slept? Trying to shake off my unease, I decided to press on with my hike. But as the day wore on, I was on high alert. Every snapped twig or rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The footprints made it clear that I wasn't alone, and I felt it necessary to keep my guard up. As dusk approached, I contemplated making my way back to civilization, but pride and the fading daylight convinced me to set up camp again, this time in a more concealed location. That night, as I sat by my campfire, the forest seemed more alive and more menacing than before. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the eerie silence. Then, something in the distance caught my eye. Another campfire, flickering faintly through the trees. I scurried to put out my own fire as quickly as possible, hoping to conceal my presence. As curiosity overcame my initial fear, I decided to approach the other campfire, not really knowing what to think. As I neared, the light from the fire illuminated a figure sitting by it. It was a man, large and imposing, his back turned to me. Something about his posture, tense and alert, gave me a bad feeling. As I sat and watched for a minute, suddenly the man stood and turned to his right towards a pile of firewood. As he took a step towards it, he turned his head and our eyes met. At first he was taken aback, like he was surprised. But as the gears in his head turned and he began to process that there was a stranger in the woods spying on him, his expression changed, and his eyes became aggressive, boring into mine with an intensity that I can't even describe. "What the hell?" the man exclaimed in a booming voice. In my panic, I scrambled backwards and took off. As I ran, the thicket grew denser, branches scratching at my face and arms, but I didn't slow down. Suddenly a gunshot rang out, the sound violently reverberating through the woods, heightening my terror to an almost unbearable level. Behind me, the man's heavy footsteps were joined by a deep, bellowing voice. He was yelling something incomprehensible, a jumble of words that I couldn't quite make out over my own panting breath, and the ominous echo of the gunshot still ringing in the air. My mind raced as I dashed through the woods, desperately seeking escape. Ahead, I spotted a small ravine, its edges obscured by underbrush. Without a second thought, I slid down its slope, my hands clawing at the dirt to slow my descent. The ravine provided a natural cover, and I crouched down, trying to steady my breathing. From my hiding place, I could hear the man's shouts growing distant. He was still searching, but he was moving away from my location. I waited, every muscle tensed, listening for any sign that he was doubling back. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. I was in a predicament now. I'd followed the light of the man's campfire upon approach, but now that I needed to get back to my own campsite, I couldn't do so without turning on my flashlight and giving away my position. If I tried to navigate my way back in the dark, I would have gotten lost for sure. I chastised myself for letting my curiosity walk me into such a harrowing situation. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. As the first light of dawn started creeping through the trees, I finally mustered the courage to climb out of the ravine. I made my way back to my campsite, packed up my gear with shaking hands, and didn't stop moving until I reached the safety of my car. I never found out who the man was. For all I know, he was just minding his own business, and I intruded into his campsite. But then again, I pondered over the footprints that I found in my own campsite that first night. Was this the man that had paid me a visit? If not, then who did and what were they up to? I left the woods with more questions than answers, the mystery of the man and the footprints around my tent unresolved. I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked that first night, but in the same breath, I was disappointed in myself for being the one to do the stalking in the end. Lots of lessons were learned that weekend, and in the weeks and months to come, I spent a lot of time reassessing my understanding of the delicate balance between adventure and caution. Story 9. The Recluse. I've always found so much peace in nature. There's something about the vastness of the wilderness that grounds me, especially in those moments when the weight of urban life becomes too much. At 32, with a demanding job and a crumbling relationship, the thought of a solo camping trip seemed like a perfect escape. I chose a remote spot in the mountains, far from the popular trails. It was a good 3-hour hike in, which meant I wouldn't likely run into anyone. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, and the seclusion was exactly what I needed. When night fell, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. As I lay in my tent, listening to the soothing sounds of the forest, I felt the stress of the past few months melt away. But that peace was short-lived. Just after midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to make out any distinguishable noises. Was it an animal, or perhaps another camper? I was out in the middle of nowhere. Who else could possibly be out here? I thought to myself. The steps were deliberate, though. Human. They circled my tent, pausing occasionally, as if whoever it was studying my campsite. Every rational bone in my body told me it was just a curious wanderer, maybe someone lost, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at my gut. I finally called out, "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. Then the footsteps retreated. I spent the night on high alert, every little sound sending my heart racing. But as dawn broke and the forest came alive with the chirping of birds, I chided myself for being paranoid. It was probably just a curious individual that meant no harm. Shaking off the unease, I decided to explore the area. As I walked, I noticed something unsettling. Footprints. Not those of an animal, but a pair of boots, similar to mine but larger. They seemed to be following the same path I was on, but were scattered randomly, as if the person was wandering without purpose. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I decided to head back to my camp. As I approached, I noticed that something was off. My tent, which I had made sure to zip up when I left, was open, and its contents were strewn about. I quickly packed up, deciding to cut my trip short. The thought of someone watching, following, and now rummaging through my things was too much. I wanted to get out of there and be around people again. The hike back was nerve-wracking. I scanned the woods and constantly looked behind me, my paranoia at an all-time high. I felt like I was being watched, stalked. After what felt like hours, I needed to take a break. I pulled off the trail and propped myself up against a tree, taking a moment to catch my breath. I didn't intend to take that long of a break, but I guess the lack of sleep from the previous night and constant paranoia finally caught up with me. Before I knew it, I had dozed off. I don't believe I was out long, but when I snapped out of it, my eyes caught the sight of a man standing beside a tree, about 20 feet away from me. He was tall, scruffy, with wild eyes that darted around erratically. He looked like he hadn't bathed in days. Panicking, I leapt up and started backpedaling towards the trail. He took a step at me, then another. Not knowing who this person was, or what his intentions were, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned and ran down the trail, shooting a solitary glance over my shoulder to see that he had also stepped out onto the trail. I ran until I reached my car. By the time I got there, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. I fumbled with my keys, half expecting the man to appear any second, but I managed to start the car and speed away. Once I reached the main road, I pulled over, the weight of what had happened finally sinking in. I called the police and reported the incident. They sent a few people out and did a small search, but found no trace of the man. The officers speculated that he might have been a recluse, someone who had been living off-grid and saw my presence as a threat. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but nothing else ever came of it. I haven't been camping since. The wilderness, which once brought me peace, now only brings back memories of that terrifying encounter. It's a shame. I used to love going out into the woods. Maybe I'll go back someday, just not alone, and certainly not to those parts of the woods. Story 10. The Screaming Deer. At 26, I was living that city grind office job, late nights, and way too many takeouts. One weekend, feeling particularly trapped in the relentless hustle of life, I decided I needed a change of scenery. A taste of nature seemed like the ideal escape. On a nostalgic whim, I grabbed my dusty camping gear from my college days and headed out to that tranquil forest spot the guys and I used to camp at during spring breaks. The drive out was transformative. With each mile, the city's skyscrapers and busy streets were replaced by towering trees and winding roads. I watched the sun start to set, casting an amazing orange glow over the treetops, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The radio played some old tunes, and the cooler air seeping in from the cracked windows was filled with the scent of pine and earth. After parking, I quickly set up my tent and gathered some firewood. The night was pleasantly cool, so I built a crackling fire. I remember its light creating a comforting bubble in the growing darkness. With a beer in hand, I lounged back, letting the sounds of nature replace the worries of office deadlines and city life. The chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the fire's soft crackling were music to my ears. After soaking in the ambiance of nature for a while, I decided it was time to hit the sack. I put out the fire, zipped myself in, and closed my eyes. But just as I was teetering on the edge of sleep, an unsettling noise ripped through the night's calm. This wasn't something that you get to hear in the woods all the time. It was frantic, the thudding of hooves, fast-paced and growing louder. Deer? I thought. There seemed to be a lot of them, and they were moving quickly. As they whipped by my campsite, I could hear something giving chase as well. Whatever it was big. I listened as the hooves and their pursuer faded off into the distance. That was crazy, I thought to myself. Little did I know that the craziness was just getting started. For a moment, it was deafeningly quiet. But then, suddenly, a harrowing deer scream cut through the night. It wasn't a warning call, it was a call of distress. The last gasps of a forest creature pleading for its life. If you've never heard one, trust me, it's the stuff nightmares are made of. The forest instantly muted, as if every living thing was holding its breath. In the eerie silence, I strained to listen, my eyes wide and my body frozen in place. For probably 20 minutes it was completely silent, like everything in the forest knew something terrible had just happened, and nothing wanted any part of it. The silence was finally broken by the sound of something approaching. It crept closer and closer. I was so frozen that I couldn't even blink. I could hear twigs breaking and leaves rustling. It was as if whatever was approaching wanted me to know that it was. As it neared my campsite, it stopped. Whatever it was seemed to be just on the periphery of my campsite now. For a few seconds there was silence, but then a deep guttural growl vibrated through the ground, resonating within my chest and setting my nerves on edge. Thoughts raced through my mind. Was it a bear? What else could it be? I've never been so overcome with fear before in my life. The only thing I could think to do was stay quiet and hope that whatever it was would lose interest. Then, out of nowhere, a horrific snap echoed through the woods, quickly followed by a heavy thud just a few feet from my tent. My heart pounded like a jackhammer in my chest. The thin fabric of my tent felt utterly inadequate against whatever lurked outside. Then, I heard the sound of leaves rustling and twigs breaking once again. I followed the sound, as it slowly made its way around the exterior of my campsite and trailed off into the woods, becoming more and more distant. It seemed that my strategy, or whatever you want to call it, of remaining still and quiet had worked. Whatever it was had lost interest and made its way out. Still petrified with fear, I continued to lay there frozen. When morning finally broke, the golden rays of the sun penetrated through the thin veil of my tent. With trembling hands, I cautiously unzipped it, not knowing what to expect. Stepping out, the sight of what my eyes caught would be seared into my mind forever. It was the lower portion of a torn deer leg. I say torn, because that was exactly what it was. Its raw and ragged edges made it clear that it had been torn off and not cut. Without wasting a second, I packed up. My earlier love for the forest was now replaced with a bone-deep dread. I loaded up and made my way out, leaving the leg and the forest in my rearview mirror. Seeking the comfort of civilization, I stopped at a diner to get some coffee and process my thoughts. So many things ran through my mind. What in the hell came through my campsite last night? What has the power to produce such a deep, reverberating growl like that? And what in the woods has the power to snap a leg off of a deer? A bear? That's impossible. It was clear, though. Whatever snapped that leg off of that deer was sending a message. You're in my territory, and you're not welcomed here. I returned to the city with a newfound appreciation for the comforts of urban life. The woods, while beautiful, harbor some secrets that we apparently don't yet understand. Whatever it is that's out there, I pray no other human being encounters like I did. They may not be as lucky as I was.